So I'll talk about the G in the GEB. I'll talk about some games. And in particular, I'll talk about network games. So what's the setting we are looking at? I have an undirected graph, an undirected network. And I have a set of agents on this network who want to route traffic. Okay, so every agent has a source and a destination, wants to select a path from the source to the destination to route traffic. How do they share the cost of routing? Every edge has a fixed cost. If the edge is used by at least one agent, then you have to pay that fixed cost. And the agents using the edge simply share the cost equally. Okay, so you take the cost of the edge, split it equally among all the agents using the edge. So that's how cost is shared. And the overall goal, of course, is to minimize the total cost of routing. Okay, I want to minimize the total cost of all the agents, all the edges that are used in my routing network. Okay, so let's put some notation down. So I have a graph G, and this will be undirected in this talk. There are a bunch of agents. I'll typically denote agents, index agents by I. So agent I needs to choose a path P sub I from her source destination Si to her source vertex Si to her destination vertex Ti. Okay, so this is the choice that the agent makes, chooses some path. Now the cost that the agent pays is the sum over all the edges in this path. Okay, so I'll typically call this the shared cost of the agent. Sum of all the edges on this path of the cost of the edge divided by the number of agents using the edge. Okay, so here C of E is the cost of edge E, and N of E is the number of agents using edge E. Okay, so this is the cost of the agent. And my goal, or the overall objective, is to minimize total cost. So I want to minimize the total cost, which you can denote in multiple ways. You can either think of this as the sum of costs of all the agents. Oh, I see. So let me use something else. Let's call this sigma I. Yes, so you want to minimize the sum of all the agent costs, which can also be written as the sum of all costs of edges that are used in a network. So edges for which the number of agents using the edge is at least one. So this is the setup. Any questions about this till now? Okay. So let's look at a quick example. So let's say this is my overall graph. There are two agents. Agent 1 wants to send traffic from Si to Ti. Agent 2 from S2 to T2. Now which are the edges that will be used in the routing? If you think about it, the best option in this graph would be to use the edges that I've marked in red. Okay, this has a total cost of 7, and as you can see, it connects S2 to T2 as well as S1 to T1. Okay, so that's the best possible solution you can come up with. Now this, if for some of you who have seen this problem earlier, it's a classic problem in algorithm design. It's called the Steiner-Forest problem and has been studied for quite a few years now. In particular, since the early 90s, we know that the best algorithm for this problem has an approximation factor of 2. By the way, so let me quickly say what approximation factors are. So this problem, for instance, is an NP-hard problem. So we don't hope to solve it exactly, but we can hope to come up with solutions that are close to the best, to the optimal solution. And when I say that an algorithm has an approximation factor of 2, it just means that I'm guaranteeing that the algorithm will produce a solution which is at most a multiplicative factor of 2 away from the optimal solution. Okay, so it would be at most twice the cost of the optimal solution. So this problem is sort of solved, and we know exactly what the status of the problem is. However, I told you, I promised you that I'll talk about games. So where are the games coming in? So the setting that we are interested in today is one where the agents are actually strategic. Okay, what does that mean? It means that the agents have no interest in achieving a solution that's globally optimal. All that they care about is their own individual interest, which is their shared cost, sigma I. Okay? That's what they want to minimize. They don't care what the overall cost is. Of course, as the designer, you want to minimize overall cost, but you don't have control over what choices the agent makes. And the choices that the agents make are simply driven by their own strategic interests rather than any global optimization. Okay? So that's the setting we are going to consider this problem in. Now, let's go back to our example and see what this means. Now, imagine that these were the two paths that the agents were using. So S2 was using the path, the red path is the one used by agent 2, the green path is used by agent 1. As you can see on the central edge, the edge of cost 2, the two agents are actually sharing the cost equally. Okay, that's the only edge that both agents are using, and they're splitting the cost equally amongst themselves. So now, one of these two agents realizes that, in fact, she has a better path. Okay? So the green agent here can switch to this new path. Remember earlier, the green agent was paying a cost of 5. Now, the green agent's only interest is minimizing her own cost. So she decides unilaterally to shift to this different path that has a slightly lower cost for her. Okay? This has a cost of 4.5 for the green agent. But note that the green agent is not paying any attention to what's happening to the red agent. The red agent earlier had a cost of 3. By this act of switching, the red agent's cost has now grown to 3.5. Okay, so the green agent has actually made the red agent's solution worse by unilaterally switching to the new path. But now this gives the opportunity for the red agent to make a choice as well, and she can switch to this new path, which now has a cost of 2.5. Earlier, she was paying 3.5. Okay? So this is the dynamics that we are talking about. Agents can move to paths that give them a lower cost. And in response to one agent moving, the other agents can also make moves. Okay, so this, and it turns out that in this particular example, the set of edges being used in the solution that I have shown here, is in fact the same as the set of edges in the optimal solution. Okay? So this, in fact, is optimal. And if you think about it a little, you'll see that this, in fact, is also a stable solution in the sense that none of these agents has any incentive to move to a new path. But this is entirely coincidental. Okay? This need not be the case all the time. In fact, the situation can be quite bad. So let's look at this sort of classic example. I have n agents sitting at this vertex S, wanting to send traffic to vertex T. And there are two different routes that they can send traffic on. One route has a cost of n. The other has a cost that's slightly higher than 1. Now, if all the agents are residing on the top edge, of all of them have chosen the top path, then I claim that no agent has incentive to unilaterally deviate to the lower path, to the bottom path. Okay, because they are paying a shared cost of 1 each. If any one of them moves to the bottom path, then their cost will increase to 1 plus epsilon. So even though no agent has any incentive to deviate, of course, this is a pretty bad solution. You're using a very high cost edge instead of using a very low cost edge. So this is a phenomenon that we will see soon. But what this says is that it's not always the case in such a strategic setting that strategic behavior of agents leads to some kind of global optimality. Okay, it can lead to significant inefficiency. Now, as most of you must have realized by now, this is simply a game in the classic game theory sense. So agent strategies are routing paths. So every agent has to pick one of her strategies. The different strategies are these different routing paths that the agent can pick. The payoff of the agent, how much the agent is get paid, in a particular setting, in a particular choice of strategies, is in fact the negative of the shared cost of the agent. Okay, so in the way games are usually set up is that, and there are a bunch of agents, every agent has a set of strategies, and given the strategies of all the different agents, you have a payoff for every agent, and every agent's individual interest is simply to maximize her own payoff. Here, as I said, every agent's own objective is to minimize their shared cost, which is the same as maximizing the negative of the shared cost. Okay, so the agent's payoff is the negative of the shared cost, and as I said, each agent in fact tries to maximize payoff. Okay, so this is the game that this problem represents, or this class of problems represent, as we will see soon. And an equilibrium state, so this is a Nash equilibrium again in the traditional Nash equilibrium sense. An equilibrium state is one where no agent has a less expensive routing path given the strategies that all the other agents are playing. Okay? So a state is defined by the strategies that all the agents are playing, and it's in equilibrium if no single agent can unilaterally deviate and improve her payoff. Okay? In this case, it's an equilibrium if no agent can change her routing path and decrease her cost, her shared cost. So this is just a solution concept. So if you give me the strategies that each agent is playing, it's either in equilibrium or not in equilibrium. It's said to be in equilibrium provided no agent has an unilateral incentive to deviate. Okay? So don't think of dynamics of how I got to this state. It's just a definition of whether the state is in equilibrium or not in equilibrium. Any other questions? All right, so that's what an equilibrium is. Now the first question that you should ask yourself is, do equilibriums even exist? Okay, it's not completely obvious that there are equilibriums in for any network and any set of agents. In fact, Nash showed that if I allowed what's called a mixed strategy equilibrium, this is the famous Nash theorem, if I allow mixed strategy equilibriums, then they always exist in all such games. However, what I'm allowing here is for every agent to simply pick a single routing path. Okay, and these are known as pure strategy equilibriums. I don't allow you to choose a distribution over multiple paths. Okay, and in many games, if I insist that all the agent strategies must be pure, i.e. they must be deterministic, then equilibriums don't exist. Turns out, though, that that's not the case in these games, and we'll see a reason very soon. In fact, we'll see a full proof of this. Okay? So for now, just believe me that equilibriums always exist in such games, in these network formation games. Yeah? So that's what we will get to soon. Okay? So now that we know that equilibriums do exist, although we haven't seen a proof yet, the next obvious question is what Rajshekhar asked: how good are these equilibriums? Okay? In particular, can we get to very suboptimal equilibriums? Equilibriums that are extremely much more expensive than the optimal solution. And the answer to this, of course, is something we have already seen. In fact, if we go back to this example that we saw a few slides ago, see that this is in fact an example of an extremely suboptimal equilibrium. It's the suboptimality, the ratio of the cost of this equilibrium state to the optimal cost is actually n, or in more generally polynomial in the number of agents. Okay? So you can get, so the worst case in equilibrium is actually pretty bad here. And this measured the ratio of these two quantities, the cost of the worst equilibrium and the cost of the optimal solution, is usually called the price of anarchy. Okay, so the price of anarchy of this game is actually polynomial in the number of agents. There can be, yes. So that's why in this statement I've said it's the worst equilibrium, the one that has the maximum cost. So in this particular instance, so it's worst case over two different things. It's worst case over the instance of the problem, which defines the graph and the set of agents, and then I'm taking worst case over all the equilibria for that problem instance.
In this case, which would be the other equilibrium?
So another equilibrium here is everyone to use the cheap path. Okay, so if everyone is on the bottom path, then their shared cost is 1 over n, slightly more than 1 over n. And again, no one has an incentive to go to the expensive path. Okay, so this is an example of a game where you do have a very good equilibrium. In fact, the optimal solution is an equilibrium, but you also have extremely bad equilibria. Other questions? Okay, so just to reiterate, it's worst case over two things: worst case over the choice of the instance, and worst case over the set of equilibria that that instance has. Okay. So the worst case equilibrium or the price of anarchy gap is actually n here. So the next question is, well, yeah, there's a bad equilibrium, but that doesn't really mean anything. Maybe we can look at the best equilibrium. For example, in this solution, as we just discussed, in fact, there's a very good equilibrium as well. If everybody is using the bottom path, then the ratio of the cost of that equilibrium state to the optimal cost is in fact 1. It is the optimal solution. Okay, and that's an equilibrium. So naturally the question arises, well, how inefficient, and inefficiency basically means this ratio, the worst case ratio over all instances of the equilibrium cost and the optimal cost. So how inefficient is the best equilibrium? And one sort of, the motivation for studying this is that imagine a system where you're designing a network and there's some controller who designs all these routing paths. Now, the controller can choose routing paths, so it's not that the agents themselves choose the paths, except that the controller must make every agent happy in a local sense. I.e., the controller gives the routing path and the agent should not be able to find a different path given the current state of the system that gives it a lesser cost. Okay? So this is a question of whether in such a setting can the controller choose certain routing paths that minimizes the overall cost of the system. Okay, and this measure, this ratio of the best equilibrium, cost of the best equilibrium to the optimal cost is called the price of stability of these games. And these two solution concepts, these two measures, price of stability and price of anarchy, are fairly popular in game theory nowadays. A lot of people study these for various different games. The notion of price of stability was in fact introduced for these games, for network games. Okay, so that's what we want to study now. We want to understand the price of stability of these games. Now, to understand this, the first observation that we make is that this is an example of what is known as a potential game. Okay, so we'll see what a potential game is. But let me first give you a very high-level picture of what's going on in these games. So imagine that you come up with some potential function, a global function, defined on the entire state of the system. And you can show that whenever an agent moves to a cheaper path, whenever an agent makes an improving move, the global potential of the system actually decreases. If you can show this with the additional property that the global potential has some kind of a lower bound, typically showing that this potential is non-negative, one thing that this immediately implies is that there must be an equilibrium in this game. Because I can start the game at any state I want. It has a certain potential. I keep running the game. Every agent, if an agent has a better path, the agent moves to that path. I know that any such move decreases my potential. And of course, my potential cannot decrease forever because it's lower bounded. And you need to also lower bound the amount of decrease. It should not be a series. It should not be an infinite series. In that case, you can then easily conclude that the number of such steps, the number of potential decreases, has to be finite. You have to stop somewhere, and therefore you will get an equilibrium state. So depending on which state you start from, it can lead to different equilibria. Exactly. Depending on where you start, you can reach different equilibria. In particular, if you start at those equilibrium states, you will simply stay there. Nothing will happen. Okay, any confusion about this? Yeah.
Optimal cost is the cost of total all the agents.
Exactly. Could be different, yes.
So the optimal cost in that way would be the minimum?
No, the optimal cost doesn't have to do anything with equilibria. The optimal cost is, if I want to connect all these agents, what's the minimum cost way for me to do it? So that has nothing to do with the game per se. It's just an optimization question. I give you a network. I want you to select a subset of edges of the network that connects S1 to T1, S2 to T2, S3 to T3, and so on. What's the minimum cost collection of such edges?
And it doesn't have to be.
No, not necessarily. Any other questions? Okay, so let's see why this is a potential game. So here's a potential function. For every edge E, let me define a function C times C times the harmonic of the number of agents using the edge. Okay, so this is my potential function for any particular edge, and my overall potential function is simply the sum of this potential function E over all edges in the graph. Okay. Now my claim is, so this is a very simple potential function. My claim, and this is the crucial claim, is that if an agent makes a move, then the change in the shared cost of that agent is exactly equal to the change in this potential. Okay? So let's take a toy example. Let's say I have an agent who was using edge E, now moves to using an edge E prime. So what was the cost that the agent was paying on edge E? Exactly, so the agent was paying a cost of CE divided by NE on edge E. Okay? So this cost gets subtracted from the agent's overall cost, because the agent has now moved out of edge E. When an agent moves into edge E prime, what's the additional cost that the agent pays on edge E prime? So CE prime divided by NE prime plus 1, because the agent has now moved in here. Okay? So now let's look at the expressions for the potential of edge E and E prime. What's happening to the potential for edge E? Well, if an agent moves out of this edge, then the number of agents decreases by 1, which means that this term loses its last term here. Okay? Similarly, on edge E prime, the number of agents increases by 1, so it gains a term at the end, which is exactly this term. So as you can see, the change in the shared cost exactly tracks what's happening in the potential. Change in potential is exactly equal to the change in shared cost. And of course, I didn't need to take a single edge for this. No matter how many edges are on my paths, this argument applies on an edge by edge basis, right? For every edge, this argument applies. Yeah. I don't think so. So the point is that I have this equal sharing scheme. So my shared cost, in fact, is C divided by NE.
Right, but I mean, couldn't you replace the sum, the harmonic series with the sum up to n arbitrary function of n, and the argument would still work, you'd still be losing the last term in the series?
That might be true. Yeah, so it's probably true that you can use an arbitrary function. That's true. You need to see what exact properties the function must have, but I think you can use other functions probably.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a game where there isn't a potential.
Yeah. I mean, many games don't have, rock, paper, scissors, for example, does not have a potential. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the change in cost is exactly tracking the change in potential. What that implies is that for every improving move, well, my change in cost must be negative, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't be making the move. Which means for every improving move, the change in potential is in fact going to be negative. Yeah, so my potential will keep decreasing as I keep playing this game. And in fact, you can lower bound how much the decrease is. It can't be too small. The decrease is going to be smallest cost divided by n. Yeah, of course, this potential, the way I have defined my function, it can't be negative, which means that every game has to terminate after finite number of steps and will yield an equilibrium when it terminates. But not only that, this property gives me something more. Okay, so what does it give me? Instead of starting at an arbitrary state, let me start my game at the optimal state. So whatever is my optimal configuration of paths, let me start my game there. This might not be an equilibrium, but let me run my game starting at that state. So what do I have? What property do I have at the optimal state? Well, I know that at the optimal state, the potential, just by the way it's defined, is going to be at least the cost of the optimal state. By the way, is this visible because of the lights, or should I write lower? It's fine? Okay. So initially, I have a potential that's at least the optimal potential. But more importantly, this potential is at most the optimal cost times the harmonic of the number of players I have. Okay, and I'll kind of interchangeably use n for the number of players and the number of vertices. You could use k here if you want, but in the worst case, that's n. So that's my initial potential, opt times the harmonic of n. Now as the game proceeds, my potential can only decrease. So eventually, when I get to an equilibrium state, I can claim that my potential is still at most opt times h of n. Okay? But note that the potential in any state, the potential dominates the cost itself of the edges, right? Because the first term itself gives you the cost, and then it might have some other terms for every edge. So the potential at equilibrium is going to be at least the equilibrium cost, at least the equilibrium cost. Put these two together, what you have is that at equilibrium, the cost is no more than the cost at the optimal solution times the harmonic of n. Okay? Of course, this quantity is basically like log n. So what this is saying is that there exists some equilibrium state. No matter what my graph is, there always exists some equilibrium state that's at most log more expensive than the optimal state. Okay? Or in other words, the price of stability is no worse than log n, or log k if k is the number of agents. Is this clear? Any questions? Yeah. Is this? That's what the rest of the talk is on. Okay. All right. So this is just the same calculation as I did here, and this is due to Anshelevich, Dasgupta, Kleinbach, Tardosh, Wexler, and Roughgarden, who also introduced this notion of price of stability and this entire branch of network formation games. All right, so the interesting question as John raised is this tight. Can this be improved? Yeah, so maybe this is telling you, giving you an upper bound, but maybe there's a better upper bound. Maybe there's always an equilibrium that's much closer to the optimal solution, and we don't know the answer. Okay, so it's still open after 15 years what the actual answer to this problem is, what the real ratio is. Now I should mention that there are several sort of comments here. The first is that it's known that log n is not tight. Okay, so there was a paper by Lee that showed a slightly better bound of log n over log n, although using essentially the same techniques and being a bit more careful in how they do the accounting. Okay? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the price of stability does not have anything to do with the potential function. It's just the ratio of costs. It's the ratio for the best equilibrium. You take the cost of the best equilibrium and take its ratio with the optimal cost. Yeah, so this is the potential function is just a way of bounding the price of stability in this case. Okay, so the first comment is that in fact log n is known to not be tight, but only by a tiny log n factor. So we don't really know what the tight answer is. The best lower bounds are in fact very small constants. So there have been a lot of papers trying to come up with lower bounds, and I think over a series of 5 or 6 papers, the constant has improved from 1.5 or so to 3 point something. Okay, so there's a huge gap. There's a gap between log n over log n and some very really tiny constants. And I think a lot of people believe that the answer lies in the constant regime rather than in the logarithmic regime. We'll see some evidence for why people believe this. I should also mention that if I, instead of an undirected graph, if I consider a directed graph, of course the entire analysis that I showed here will still work. I never use the fact that the graph is undirected. So if I have a directed graph, then in fact it is known from the original paper itself that log n is tight. So there is an instance of the game where the gap, the price of stability is exactly log n. Okay? So in the absence of progress, what do we do? Well, one of the things we can do is make the problem a little more specialized. In particular, one line of work that has been quite prominent is in what are called broadcast games. So what's a broadcast game? It specializes this general network formation game in 2 different ways. The first is that it takes all the agents, and for all of them it says that there's a single destination node. Okay, so the destination node is common for all the agents. And this also makes sense in certain practical settings, because you can think of the destination maybe as a gateway node to where you want to route all the traffic so that the traffic can leave the network. Okay, so that's specialization 1. Specialization 2, or special property 2, is that every vertex has an agent. Okay, earlier maybe there were vertices in the graph that did not have agents. In this special case, in the case of broadcast games, every vertex will have an agent. Okay? And there are a series of results for broadcast games, much better results. So there was a paper that initially gave a log and a log n bound on the price of stability. It was improved to log n and eventually to a constant. Although I must mention that the lower bound for broadcast games is almost the same as for general games. It's around 2 or 3. The upper bound, this constant result, the upper bound is something like 6,000. So if you don't believe in this notation of O of 1, then there's a huge gap as well. All right, so we'll talk about broadcast games. And I won't actually show you any of these results because they are somewhat technical. But what I will show you is why do these assumptions, how do they help us, okay? So what I'll show you, in fact, is a way to still obtain a logarithmic bound, but using a completely different technique that's very specific to broadcast games. And in fact, more refined versions of these techniques lead to these results. Okay, let's look at an example. So here's a broadcast game. I have a graph. There's a single destination node. It's often called the root. Every vertex in the graph wants to send traffic to this route and has to choose a path to do so. Yeah, and here I've shown an example set of paths that these vertices take. So the first question is, what is the optimal solution? So we are comparing equilibria to optimal solutions. What is the optimal solution for a broadcast game? Sorry? Not necessarily. Everyone could do the same. Well, they are not co-located. Remember, the sources are not the same. But this is one of the most classic problems in combinatorial optimization. Okay, it's called the minimum spanning tree problem. Okay, so all you are really trying to do is you are trying to connect all the vertices in a minimum cost graph. Okay? So the optimal solution is simply minimum spanning tree here. That's what we are competing against. All right, so what's special about broadcast games? So here's one thing. The first property that's special is that you can ensure that, or you can prove that all the equilibria states are in fact trees. Okay, so there will be no cycles at equilibrium. This seems kind of intuitively should be the right thing to do. I have everyone sending traffic to a single vertex. Why should I use cycles? But let's look at a more formal way of showing this. So let us imagine that there is a cycle at equilibrium. I want to refute this possibility. Now there are two possibilities. So the first case is, what if my root is on the cycle? Okay, the root vertex itself is on my cycle. So here's my cycle, the root vertex sits here. What tells me that I can't have a cycle like this? Okay, so the first thing to observe is that if I look at the two edges leading to the root in the cycle, how do I use these edges in routing? There's only one way that I can use edges incident on the root. And that is, my direction of traffic should be going towards the root, not away from it. There's no point in me having a path that goes to the root and then again leaves it. If I reach the root, I'm done. Okay, so both of these edges must be used in paths that are going towards the root. What does this mean? Well, one of the things it means is that there must be a vertex somewhere where there's a branching happening. So the vertex has two paths which use the edges in opposite directions. Okay, if there's a merging here, there has to be a branching somewhere. Otherwise, all the cycle edges are not being used. And if there's a branching, then I claim I'm done. Why? Because this is not possible. If I have two paths going through a vertex, so let's say I have two paths going from source U and source V through this vertex, and then this path takes a different route to the root vertex, this path takes a different route, these two paths take different routes to this destination, then I claim that if I move one of them to the other, it must always be the case that I improve my cost. Why? Because if these two have the same shared cost, then of course if I move any one to the other, my shared cost improves because the number of users has improved at least by one. Therefore, in fact, wherever I am moving to, the shared cost drops, and therefore I have an improvement. If these shared costs are unequal, I can use exactly the same argument, except that I now want to move the more expensive one to the cheaper one. Okay? So at any point on the cycle, if I have a branching, which means that there are two paths that go through this vertex but use different ways to get to the root, I can always move one to the other, and that will improve my cost. Okay? So this cannot be an equilibrium state. So that's case one. Now case two, let's say the root is not on the cycle. Okay, so again I have a cycle, maybe the root is not on it. Now one problem with the root not being on the cycle is that maybe I don't have any branching. Of course, if I have a branching on the cycle, then I can use exactly the same argument. But maybe all the edges in the cycle are used in the same direction. Okay, I go around the cycle. Now since the root is not on the cycle, there must be an edge from the cycle leaving it. Right? Because otherwise, any path that's on the cycle just keeps circling around the cycle. It has no way to leave the cycle. But if it leaves it, then let's look at this vertex, the vertex where there's a leaving edge. Again, this vertex has two different paths going through it. One leaves it, at least one of them leaves it, and at least one of them continues on the cycle and maybe leaves at some other point. And I have exactly the same argument. I again have a vertex that sends traffic to the root on two different paths. One of them is always better, I can move to that path. Okay? So at equilibrium, if I have a common root, okay, in fact, I didn't use both properties of broadcast at all. I just used one property, the fact that all of them are going to a common root. So if all of the vertices are going to all of the vertices are sending traffic to a common root, then it must be the case that at equilibrium, the graph, the set of edges being used in routing is acyclic. Okay, it forms a tree. So that's property 1. Yes, because these are undirected edges, I can use it whatever way I want. No, it won't. Yeah. So it will be what's called an arborescence. It's everything will, all the traffic will move up to the root on the tree. Okay? So that's the first property. The second property, and this is somewhat more technical, but used heavily in the analysis of these games, is that I can now associate every edge in my routing tree. Remember, my tree, the routing at equilibrium is a tree, right? I can associate every edge in my routing tree with a specific vertex in the graph, right? So for example, here's an edge EV. I simply associate it with the vertex V, where, as shown in the picture. Now this association, of course, you can do on any tree. But the crucial fact is that V is an agent. You know that because it's a broadcast game. Every vertex has an agent. So what you do is, instead of thinking of bounding the total cost of the edges of your routing tree, you simply try to bound the total cost associated with the agents, where every agent is simply responsible for one edge in the routing, okay, the first edge on its path. So this is just a mapping. It's a mapping from the set of edges to the set of agents. How does this mapping help? To show how this mapping helps, I'll digress for a few minutes and go into a technique called dual fitting. I won't give details, so this is a much more generic technique. It comes from linear programs and so on. I won't go into the details of what dual fitting does, but let me tell you what it does in the context of this problem. Okay? So what is dual fitting? Imagine that I have this kind of a routing network, the one I have shown, and I have associated the cost of every edge, every green edge, with a particular vertex, the way I showed in the previous slide. So now each of these vertices, each of the agents, has a cost sitting on it. Now let me go to the agents and draw a circle around the agent of radius proportional to this cost that was sitting on the agent. Okay, so for example, this agent S1, or this agent at the corner on top, had a cost of 2, so I have drawn a circle of radius 2 over alpha around it. The agent there had a cost of 1, I've drawn a circle of radius 1 over alpha around it. Okay. Where am I drawing those circles? Well, for the purpose of understanding, just think of it geometrically. I'm drawing it on this plane, but in general, I'm drawing it in the metric space that's defined by this graph. Okay? In the vertex S3, why is it 2? Because it was using this routing path, and the first edge on that routing path is, of course, 2. It wasn't using the edge going up to S2. Okay. Any other questions? All right, so this is what I do. I draw these circles around all the vertices. Now, if I can show that these circles or these balls do not intersect, okay, there are no two balls that intersect, then I claim that the cost of the price of the ratio of the equilibrium solution to the optimal solution is no more than alpha. Okay, why is this true? The main claim here is that the radii of the circles, the sum of these radii, defines a lower bound on the optimal cost. In particular, there cannot be a spanning tree in this graph. There cannot be a tree that connects all the vertices whose cost is less than the sum of these radii. Why? Because it's a spanning tree. It has to connect all these vertices. How do I connect these vertices? Well, I have to at least traverse till the end of the cycle and leave it. And these cycles are non-intersecting. So the part where I traverse inside the cycle, inside each cycle in my spanning tree, these are disjoint, right? So no matter how I build my spanning tree, I'll have a portion equal to the radius of the circle inside the circle, and that will be disjoint from every other circle. So the sum of radii of all these circles will be a lower bound on the cost of any tree connecting all the vertices in the graph. Is this point clear? Any questions about this? Yeah.
These circles, they don't live in Euclidean space, they live on the graph metric.
They live on the graph metric, the shortest path metric of the graph. Any other questions? Okay, so if alpha were 1, of course that would say that the sum of radii of the circles being a lower bound, that would say that the cost of my routing network is exactly equal to the optimal solution. But I can choose other values of alpha, and alpha would simply show up in the ratio, right? Because I'm scaling down the size of the circle from what the actual cost is. So that's the game we will get into soon, okay? All right. Any questions about this general technique called dual fitting? Okay, and the reason it's called dual fitting is that it has some connections to LP duals and so on, but let's not go into that. Yeah.
So when you say the balls do not intersect, they're all disjoint.
They're all disjoint.
Because of course you need a lot of intersections to get
Right. So okay. So when I'm talking about the spanning tree, about the balls, I'm not even thinking about the tree. I have this metric space where I have points. I draw balls around these points, and I say that the two balls are non-intersecting if there's no point in the metric space that belongs to two different balls. Okay, and the metric space, I'm just thinking of it as an infinite set of points everywhere.
The sum of the radii of the two balls is
less than the distance between its centers. Yeah, that's another way to put it. Yeah. Well, you can still define a dual. The problem is that you can't associate the cost of edges with agents. So you have to draw balls around vertices that are not agents. And then the dual is invalid.
So this should work as long as every vertex is an agent.
That's right. Okay. And that's crucial, because if I'm drawing balls around vertices that are not agents, then that's an invalid lower bound. Because it's not true that I have to connect that vertex. Maybe I just leave that vertex alone in my solution. Any other questions? Okay, so we have this setup. Now things are a little more complicated typically. Things are usually a little more complicated in that typically we won't be able to show that in fact these balls are non-intersecting. For showing that, what we typically need to do is actually group these balls into multiple groups. So imagine that I have drawn these balls, and then somehow I group it into beta different groups, and show that each individual group is a set of non-intersecting balls. I claim then that the ratio of the two costs, the cost of the routing network and the cost of the optimal solution, then is at most alpha, which was coming from just the first observation earlier, times the number of groups I have, beta. Because each individual group, the sum of radii of the balls in each individual group now forms a lower bound to my optimal solution. Since I have beta different groups, their average will also be a lower bound. Okay? And therefore I lose this factor of beta when I take the ratio between the cost of the routing and the cost of the optimal solution. So this will be our general trick. This is the trick we'll apply in this part of the talk and again in the second part. I'll draw these balls around the vertices, I'll group them in some clever way, and then I'll show that, and then I'll claim that since the balls are intersecting, the ratio, the price of stability is in fact the product of these two terms, alpha and beta. Right, again, that will be so the choice of alpha and the choice of beta, as well as the actual groups that you form, will be what will constitute the rest of the talk. Is the plan clear? Well, yeah, so the groups are just a partitioning of the balls. Yeah. Okay. So for the first application of this technique, as I said, let's try to understand why broadcast games have in fact just a logarithmic price of stability bound. So this is not a new bound, we saw it through the potential function. However, I want to use this technique to demonstrate this technique. I want to show you that for broadcast games, in fact, this technique also shows you that the price of stability is no worse than log n. Okay? And I might not go over all the details here because it's a little painstaking, but I'll show you the general sketch of the idea. Now, how do I, so again, there are two questions. How do I form the groups? What is the scaling on the balls? So what I'll do is if the cost E of v, remember E of v is the first edge on v's routing. So if the cost E of v is in this range between 2 raised to k minus 1 and 2 raised to k, okay, I form these geometric ranges. So if the cost of E of v is in this range, I will place a ball of radius 2 raised to k over 16 around that vertex. Okay? So alpha for me is some constant. It's maybe 32 or 16 or something like that. Okay? If I'm within this geometric range of factor 2, I place a ball of radius 2 raised to k over 16. Is everybody convinced that alpha is just a constant? Okay, so the second question is, how do I group them? The way I group them is pretty easy. All balls of the same radius go into the same group. So I have all these various different radii of balls, 2 raised to k over 16 for various different k's. For any fixed k, all the balls go into the kth group. Okay? In particular, one nice property of this is that if I now focus my attention on a single group, then I see balls of exactly the same radius there. Okay? Now what I want to show, as we discussed earlier, is that these balls do not intersect. But if I'm able to show that, what would I get? Well, note that I only have logarithmically many groups. I've created these groups in powers of 2. So I have only log n groups. So beta is just log. Alpha is a constant. So if I'm able to show that these balls don't intersect, then I'm done. I get a log n bound on my price of stability. Now showing that these balls do not intersect is a little complicated. In fact, it needs me to run a game that's slightly different from the game I had been proposing earlier. So the game that I run, as earlier, I start off with the optimal state, and I keep running the game until I get to an equilibrium. But just any equilibrium does not have this property. You need to select the equilibrium in a somewhat more careful manner. So what you do is you say that if at a vertex, so what's the state I have? Is this? So I have a state of the system where I have a tree, and maybe I have some vertex u and some vertex v here. Now I say that this system is not in equilibrium if I can move this entire subtree over to v for any uv. Okay, so I'm making this if you have looked at game theory earlier, this is what's known as group strategy proofness. So I don't simply allow unilateral moves, but I also allow group moves. An entire group of vertices, I allow an entire group of agents to change their routing. And I stop only when entire groups, no such group exists. No group can change its routing and improve the overall cost, improve the cost of their own routing. Okay? So that's the difference, slight difference that I incorporate in the game. Of course, this doesn't really change what I'm trying to show, right? Because eventually I'm still getting to some equilibrium state, and this is a much stronger notion of an equilibrium state. If it's equilibrium state with this notion, it's certainly an equilibrium state with our weaker notion earlier. Okay? One thing that's a slight caveat here is that you still need to show convergence. So earlier we had this potential argument to show that the potential keeps decreasing. That's no longer true here, but you can show convergence using other techniques. Okay? So the way I define equilibrium is that no such group moves exist. Is this point clear? Okay. So now in this state, if I have this property that there are no group moves, then I claim that these balls do not intersect. So suppose they do. So I have some vertex u and some vertex v, and they have drawn balls around themselves, and these balls actually intersect. So what does that mean? It means, so firstly, I mean, let's say both u and v are in the kth group. So these balls are of radius 2 raised to k over 16, which means that this distance between u and v is actually less than 2 raised to k over 8. Right? Otherwise, they wouldn't have intersected. I'm drawing balls of radius 2 raised to k over 16. If they have to intersect, then this radius is less than the sum of two of the radii. This distance is less than the sum of these radii. Okay, so the distance is less than 2 raised to k over 8. Okay, so that's the first observation, that distance from u to v is less than 2 raised to k over 8. Now let's look at what's happening at u and v. Imagine that the number of vertices that are routing through u is n sub u, and the number of agents that are routing through v is n sub v. Okay, this is the number of agents that route through u and v respectively. So what does it mean to say that this entire group does not want to move to v? Okay, it means that their current shared cost on the path going up from u to the root is upper bounded by the shared cost they would pay if all of them moved to going through v. So what's their current shared cost? Let's split up this shared cost as the cost on the first edge out of u. Okay, so there's the first edge out of u, and this is some edge eu. There's a first edge out of v, and this is some edge ev. So it's the current shared cost on eu plus some shared cost on the other edges of the path. Let me call that remaining shared cost sigma u. So the overall shared cost that these vertices are paying from u to the root is eu divided by nu. This is the cost on this edge, eu, plus, I'm abusing notation here, I should just say cost of eu, but you understand what I'm saying. Okay, so it's the cost of eu divided by nu, that's on the first edge, plus some sigma u it's paying on the rest of the path going up to the root. And this must be smaller than 2 raised to k over 8. Okay, this is the distance from going from u to v divided by nu. Right? This would be the shared cost on going from u to v if all of them were to move, plus ev divided by nu plus nv. Okay, all the nv vertices are still resident on this edge. If the new nu vertices show up, then this would be the cost on the first edge, plus let's just say sigma v. Okay, maybe this also decreases, but I'm just taking an upper bound. But this is only one direction. So u doesn't want to move to v. Well, v doesn't want to move to u either. So we can write exactly the same expression for v as well. Okay. No, this one is fine. Oh, this one should be. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Now, what this is giving me, and I won't do the rest of the calculation, but what this gives me, the first expression gives me an upper bound on sigma u minus sigma v. Second expression gives me a lower bound on sigma u minus sigma v. And by my choice of the costs of EU and EV, it's not very hard to show that these two bounds are incompatible. Okay? So I will get an upper bound that's smaller than the lower bound. Okay? And that will give me my contradiction. Okay? So this is just a matter of working out the math after this. So that's the general idea then. I have showed that you take these two balls, and if you draw these balls using the technique that we showed here, then these balls will not intersect, and then you can rely on the dual fitting framework to obtain a bound of log n. So let me say a couple of words about multicast games before we end the first part of this talk. So what happens in multicast games, and what are multicast games firstly? So these are exactly the same as broadcast games without the assumption that every vertex has an agent. So again, everyone routes traffic to the same route, but not every vertex needs to have an agent. So this is the sort of first step of generalization beyond broadcast games, and has been a sort of major open question in the area for a while to show that in fact multicast games also have a price of stability better than log n. Still open. The problem is that I don't have so now there's this edge that's incident in my routing tree on a vertex that does not contain an agent. Okay, so the ones that are the vertices I've drawn in bold are the ones that have agents. There's this vertex in the middle that does not have an agent, right? I can't guarantee that every vertex will have an agent in my routing tree. So there's a vertex that does not have an agent. Problem is, who is responsible for the cost of edge E, the first edge out of that vertex? I can't make this vertex, the non-agent vertex, responsible for it because I can't draw a ball around it. That would be a wrong lower bound. So I can't make that vertex responsible. I can make one of these two vertices U or V responsible. But then suppose I make U responsible and U decides to move to a different path and not E anymore. How do I transfer the responsibility to V? Currently, we don't know of any mechanism to do this, and that's kind of the stumbling block that's prevented people from getting any sort of analysis for this problem. Okay? So let me quickly report some very recent progress that I made with a couple of my students, Rupert Freeman and Sam Haney. So we can show a little more than broadcast games. So the first step, something that lies between broadcast and multicast games, are what are known as multicast quasi-bipartite games. So one way of looking at broadcast games is that the only edges you have in your graph are between agent vertices. Right? Every vertex is an agent vertex, so you only have edges between two agents. Now let's take one more step and allow edges between agents and non-agents as well. Okay? Of course, in a completely general graph, you can have edges between agents and agents, agents and non-agents, and two non-agents. But if you don't allow edges between non-agents, these graphs are known as quasi-bipartite graphs. And for them, the nice property is that you still have these hollow vertices in your routing tree, vertices that don't contain agents. However, you can't have them in series because there are no edges between these hollow vertices. So all your paths are kind of short paths. And we can show that in that case, you can actually come up with a mechanism for transferring responsibility, and you can get a price of stability bound that's a constant. All right, that brings me to the end of the first part of the talk. We talked about equilibria and network games. We showed that this can have linear inefficiency, which is pretty bad. However, we showed that the best equilibrium never has worse than logarithmic inefficiency. That's exponentially better. It's open whether it has constant inefficiency or not, and this is only resolved in the case of broadcast games and multicast games on quasi-bipartite graphs. All right, any questions? Yeah.
I was wondering about the cost function. So thinking about something like the back pressure routing type pressure. You want to revert, you want less of sharing, and you want to prevent sharing. Right? In that case, does the function change enough that it's not a potential?
So these are called congestion games. So I mean, this is also technically a congestion game, but there is a class of there is a line of research on these kinds of basically traffic routing games, right? If a lot of people go on the same road, then everyone slows down. Yeah, and those and there are various bounds, various price of anarchy bounds for them. So for those kinds of games, usually the price of anarchy bounds are smaller. So you don't have to go to the best equilibrium. You can stay with the worst, and you can still get reasonable bounds. Okay, but it's a different line of work because it's kind of exactly opposite to what we are talking about.
The ball growing argument looks similar to how we embed a graph metric into L2 space.
Yeah.
Is there any improvement to the result that you could obtain if you know that the graph can be embedded with this person less than dollar, against the all-to-one? Or if we just know that the graph metric is already.
There may be, I'm not completely sure. So one thing you can do is that you can reinvent all these results by embedding on trees. I'm not 100% sure about embedding on L2, but embedding on trees, you can retrieve these results. And if you have a graph that can be embedded into a tree with constant distortion, then certainly these results improve.